It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes, and we have a hodgepodge episode for you today on today will be one day post inauguration day, but we're pretty close, within hours of it. John, how the heck are you?
Well, I'm a lot warmer. I'm back in Los Angeles. I brought my mom out here. She's in the other room. I'm back. My cat's forgiven me she might be holding a little bit of a grudge. I brought my mom back with me, but I am not freezing. And I just got word from my aunt. It's 19 below in Minnesota right now. So,
our roles have reversed because we are in the middle of our winter storm. So last night it was like 24 degrees. Tonight it's supposed to be 22. Right now it's 30 degrees. So I've been in your shoes for the past few days. What do you think of that?
I'm sorry, 30. You mean 30 below or 30? Because
30.
Yeah, that's not the shoes I was in for a month and a half.
But I feel like I was in your shoes.
You might have felt it, but you didn't really feel. If your toes fell off, then you're like you were in my shoes.
So you don't have toes anymore.
What's that?
So you don't have any toes anymore?
No, well, I don't think that. I don't really feel them half the time anymore. Ever since they just kind of dangle at the end of my feet. But yeah, we got out just before the worst day. Now it's going to warm up a little bit there in LA here. It's supposed to hit maybe 80 by the middle of the week out here. So.
Wow. All right. What's the air quality like for you guys?
It was bad yesterday when I got in, but today it actually ended up being good air quality. So on the index, so surprising, and it wasn't too bad out here. So I am living large in California right now.
Small mercies.
No, I just need the cat to forgive me and not get so pissed at my mom.
Small mercies for that good air quality today of all days.
Yes.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive right into today's hodgepodge. First one, Dana White announced a gate of over $10 million for UFC 311, despite having lost the targeted main event and having to have a new main event. Why do you think it sold so well, despite all that?
I mean, that's kind of surprising, and I don't know the exact reason it sold so well, but we can take some guesses. I mean, it went from they projected. He said they budgeted, which is their way of projecting. When they do events. We saw this in the antitrust disclosure. We saw some of their sheets they use. When they do events, they put down what their main events is, and they do projections of how much they estimate it's going to sell on pay-per-view and what's the gate going to be in the total revenue. And he had budgeted. Their projection was $7.4 million, I believe. And then before the main event fell out, they were at 9.5, he said. And then afterwards it was over 10. And a couple reasons. I mean, one might have been that, people wanted a respite from the fires maybe in California. But I think a bigger reason is not so much that Islam is a massive star, although he is something of a star. I think the big reason is that you got to say the TKO, I'll say instead of Endeavor, but TKO has gotten to be masters of selling tickets. They've shown it. Their ticket sales have skyrocketed year after year, just been growing, just huge leaps and bounds in growth on ticket sales. And then you're now seeing it happen with the WWE. And they have just become experts at maximizing the amount they can charge through whatever algorithm, software, whatever they're using. They whatever tactics they're using, they are driving up ticket prices to the max amount and maximizing the amount of gate they can see at these events. And I think that's the primary reason. Part of it is that there's interest in the fights, which is surprising considering, we got some Dagestanis headlining the event and a Georgian in the co-main event is the champion. And, usually in combat sports or any sports, Americans don't flock to foreign, especially Eastern European, is Muslim named fighters from Eastern Europe. They don't flock to them as, for events, but here they did. And I think a big part of it is that there's, the MMA fans have somewhat embraced the region, the fighters, but the bigger part is Endeavor or TKO or whatever they're calling it now. Endeavor is going to go back to being private. and they have the spin-off TKO. But the people handling the tickets, they have mastered the art of getting every dime possible out of the ticket purchaser.
Let's talk about their we have discussed before tactics that they've used. For instance, taking less shows on the road and putting more in the Apex so that when they do go on the road, they can charge more. Talk about that a little bit, and also talk about if the fact that we're in a brand new venue that was very much had that Sphere vibe to it. Could that have had anything to do with it as well? Like, hey, first UFC event of the year in a brand new event arena with all the bells and whistles.
Yeah, the Inuit arena. I think that it played a small part, but not nearly as much. It wasn't nearly as hyped. I'm out here, and I didn't hear many people talking about like they wanted to go to the event just for that. There might have been some because there's interest in the arena, but not to the degree you heard with the Sphere. So I don't think it would have made that big of impact. I do think one is, like you said, like you mentioned, they keep events in the Apex. That has driven up ticket prices. Endeavor has been getting celebrities to come, giving tickets away to VIPs, and that draws the other strange thing is because UFC is becoming so coated with conservatives and Donald Trump. I think there's a higher demand from people in the conservative sphere that want to show up in these events. It's become a flag you can wave to show what side of the partisan split you are, and that drives it a little bit. So you add all those factors together, plus they become experts in only releasing a small portion of the tickets to the market. And that way there's scarcity. And then when those are bought up, they release a bit more. And then they have, all the algorithms and stuff that they can drive, make sure they get the people willing to spend the most first. So they spend the maximum amount. And then the people that when they lower the tickets later, because they sold out that first group, there's less interest. They're maximizing the sales for individuals as much as possible. So I think all those are components, and all it just shows is they are experts. Just really mastered the art of just selling tickets for as much as possible.
California Athletic Commission reported the payouts. It's one of the last of a dying breed. Do we think those numbers are accurate, especially for Islam? And also, I would like to toss up Umar to you for dissection as well, because I could not help but notice that his purse was only $100,000 for challenging for a title, and it reminded me of when Henry Cejudo fought Demetrius Johnson the second time and actually lifted the belt off him for only $100,000. He was challenging, but it was for only $100,000.
Yeah, well, I'm not 100% sure those were legitimate because they weren't yellow in bold. And until I see yellow and bold print of those numbers, that's just the joke if you're on Twitter anytime and there's those fake numbers pop up. They're always bold yellow. Oh, here's the numbers for the event. But no, this is Athletic Commission released it. Working away. The other one big surprise for a lot of people was Holland getting 250 and 250. Got to remember, he took that fight. He got replaced he took the Chimaev fight, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. The Nate Diaz, he got a new contract. And so that guy has been living on a tremendous contract since then, probably a contract much bigger than any other fighter in his position would have. So he got that advantage. For the other ones, Merab, his $500,000, exactly what you expect. That's the amount they usually give champions plus pay-per-view points. So he will get pay-per-view bonuses on top of that. Moicano, 250. That's typical for a challenger. If he would have won, he probably would have got 100,000 bonus. They might even give him some bonus for last minute. But the other two the big ones is Islam and Umar. Umar's harder to say. Maybe he is getting that crappy a deal. Who knows? Maybe, that is possible, though you'd think with the camp, with him working with Khabib, that's way too low for the connections he has. And
he was coming in undefeated. He was 18-0 coming in. Yeah,
and then you look at Islam, Makhachev, no way is he going to be getting 250,000, 200,000. Yeah, 200,000 as his position. So I am guessing there is some sort of side letter deal for them. It's very possible. One of my guesses would be it's not just a side letter to hide the number, because they fight overseas. I don't think they're getting anywhere near what Khabib got. We know Khabib made like 10 million a fight his last couple fights. They're not anything like that, but I wouldn't be shocked if of all the people on the card, especially Islam, had a side letter deal. And I would also not be shocked if somehow it was tied into the Saudis or United Arab Emirates, and there was a deal where they paid him because then he could save on domestic taxes. Because for most fighters, when you have a side letter that pays you unreported amounts, it's still coming from the company, and you still got to report it as income you made for this event. And so a way to get around that, I imagine, I'm not saying they do this, but for Islam, but I wouldn't be shocked if for some reason he got some sort of sponsorship deal or something where it's being paid for labor done, air quotes there, for work done in the Middle East. So that way he wouldn't have to pay U.S. domestic taxes on that. That would be my guess. But if we look at what Islam is making, I would be shocked if he's not making at least a few million. I don't know if he might not have any pay-per-view points because he might not care, but I would be shocked if he's not getting at least Usman when he was getting 2.5 million plus pay-per-view. So I'd be shocked if he didn't get something like at least 3 million minimum.
Let's go back to Umar for a second and tell us on one hand why it could be 100 and on the other hand why it might not be 100, because I am just still floored by that figure. The first thing you said was challengers normally get 250 and here he is with just 100.
Well, he is at a lower weight class, so challengers could get lower than 2. But yeah, 250 seems to be the typical contract now. You have your basic show win, and then when you go into a title fight, you get a bumped up show money. No, the win bonus is usually 100,000 discretionary. They just throw it to you 100,000, but it's not in the contract. But you have a inflated now guarantee amount, and then if you win and hold the title, you get pay-per-view points. That's typically how it works. Now, it's conceivable they had 100,000, but he had won so much. He's from Khabib's gym. He's around people that have made a lot of money fighting in MMA, so he knows what's available. So you put that together. My guess is, again, he's someone that, I doubt he's getting millions because he doesn't hold the belt, but I would be shocked if he wasn't making a bit more than just 100,000 for the fight. It's possible too that they pay him some sort of bonus or diem or special sponsorship deals in Saudi Arabia, Middle East. I mean, that's another possibility because the UFC, we've talked about this. They arrange the sponsorship and they control it, and they can pick fighters to take part in the sponsorship. It's entirely possible too. Islam, I'm sure, is making millions, but for Umar, it's possible that the 100,000 is really it. And part of the way the UFC compensates them is they hook them up with a lot of Middle East sponsorship. I mean, I'm just throwing stuff out there, but something like that sounds well within the realm of stuff they've done with other fighters. And plus, because those guys are stars in the Middle East and the Middle East has tons of money they're throwing around, that could be proved to be much more lucrative for them to use those contacts to get sponsorship deals over there than what they're getting paid from the UFC. So for the UFC, that'd be a huge win because we can pay them less and keep more of the money. And all we're doing is we're providing them link ups to these very rich Gulf state officials that can pay them more money. So that's possible too. But it's almost impossible to tell what exactly they're making because there's so many variables of how they could get paid. These two specifically. For other fighters, it's very simple. American fighters, they don't do that kind of stuff for. For American fighters, I can pretty much look at a fighter, where they're on the card, where they're in their career, and I bet you I can get within, a pretty close approximation of what they would be paid because it's such a formula. But for these guys, because they fight out of Russia, which is sanctioned, because they're big stars in the Middle East, and the UFC wants to present Middle Eastern, they're not from the Middle East, but want to present fighters that appeal to the Gulf states. These guys are going to be treated different than they would a typical fighter.
Should we read anything at all into the fact that both are managed by Ali Abdelaziz?
I think not a ton, except for the fact that, that he works with the UFC. He's always willing to, get along with the UFC. So that's the only thing I would infer on that like Kamaru Usman, for years, Kamaru Usman was making, I can't remember, like 600,000 to fight as champion plus pay-per-view points, which was low actually. And eventually, because other fighters were making so much money, and one of them was Masvidal, who negotiated a much bigger deal, they got him, I think, to we saw in the Ngannou documents, which lined up with other reports we saw, that he was getting $2.5 million plus pay-per-view points at that point. But it took a while, and I think what happened, not what I think, but Ali does not seem like he was rocking the boat to get him paid that earlier. It took this incident to get him to push it later in his career after several title defenses. So, he's not notorious for fighting with the UFC. But again, Ali has connections with the Gulf state figures, and I wouldn't say Ali was responsible, but he has a relationship with the UFC, and because of those connections and other figures, Khabib made $10 million from the UFC. So it's in certain situations it ends up paying off.
You were talking about Islam earlier. Dana White is now saying that Islam is the pound for pound number one. He says, fine, all right, you got me. It's Islam. Should we read in anything at all into that?
I mean, we can read a little because it's obvious. Dana White, this is a kind of a running gag that Dana White pitches the pound for pound number one based on who he's currently selling. Remember, Demetrius Johnson was pound for pound number one 3 times a year based on every time he had a card coming up, a fight, but then it would always flop to someone else. So I think here what we saw is that John Jones was number one because they wanted to keep John Jones happy, and they were hyping the heck out of his next big fight with Miocic. They wanted to use that as publicity and help use it as marketing to drive up the sales as much as possible. Now that John Jones has retired, in air quotes there again, or Dana White says he's planning on retire, and maybe they're trying to negotiate him into taking an Aspinall fight. Now's the time to say, you know what, someone else, the new number one, because we're back to selling other fighters to push them to the audience. And also Jones hasn't agreed to this fight yet or to come back. And until he does, he's not really the number one until he concedes to what we want on our demands.
All right. In the post-fight presser, Dana said that his matchmakers were super excited by Aaron Pico, but that they would have to discuss Patricio Pitbull. Should we read into that?
I think we can somewhat. I mean, maybe we shouldn't read into it yet without more information, but we are gonna take some educated guess, ponder a little bit about the possibilities. That is probably the way I'll say it here, because one thing we know is that both of them are in PFL. Pitbull has been given his full release. Pico is now a restricted free agent because he has exclusive negotiating with PFL. That yes, Pico is younger, but Pitbull is kind of a legend in the sport. He has a storied career, especially outside the UFC, and he has made it clear he'll do whatever it takes to fight in the UFC. And he's leaving as the Bellator champion at 145. He is, you would think it'd be a no-brainer, especially if you can get him cheap, because you're going to get some return on him no matter what, because you don't really have to market him to hardcore fans. They will show up and pay extra to see him against a UFC fighter. So you have to question, why do they make that statement? And possibility is one is Pico is represented by here's where we have the link, Ali Abdelaziz, who, we know for a fact that Ali Abdelaziz is what we call, he's a friend of the UFC. Some people call it broker, but he does not contest the UFC much. He's not an adversarial management. In fact, he often talks about how he's good friends with them. We have to get along and do what work with the UFC and do what they say. So nothing adversarial coming from him, which is by definition the opposite of what a manager is supposed to do with the promoter. But that's neither here nor there. And we also know that he has offered support to the UFC during the antitrust case, which is, again, would someone comes across as unheard of for a manager to make such a statement when it's a fighter lawsuit about restrictive contracts and abuse of power and monopoly power from the promoter. So he has all that going for him. And so for the UFC, they obviously like him, and they are going to reward or make it easier. They want Ali Abdelaziz fighters in the UFC because they know they're not going to cause a lot of problems. Now, for Pitbull, you'd think, well, that's the same. He wants to be in the UFC, but he's represented by people, even though the same group, I guess, represents Poatan and Fantasia, but those guys have been in the UFC for a while and went directly there. They represent people that are willing to negotiate with other promotions to drive up their prices. And that's something UFC has never really liked. That's something they hated about Monty Cox, something they hated about Jeff Clark. There's a long list of management. that went out and tried to drive up by using promotions against each other to get the price higher. UFC is never like that. Dana White is never like that. And so you have to read into it. Okay, yes, he's old, Pitbull, his best years behind him, but who wouldn't want to see him in the UFC? Well, perhaps the UFC, if they wanted to send a message out that, we are not a second option to you. You have to be your first option. And they want that message to go through Pitbull so other fighters can get it. That's a possibility. But, we'll wait and see. My guess is maybe they're putting a little scare into Pitbull right now. Maybe they want him to find a new management or something. But I also I find it almost inconceivable that the UFC wouldn't sign him. It's free money. It's found money on the ground.
It really is. I mean, I have to say, when you say Pitbull is old, we have to remember that he's been champion so long that he only fights at the top. He was only fighting the very best of the best. And that's what he's fought for years and years and years. Put him in there against a Jose Aldo. Give him a Volkanovski. Have him fight Pico and have the winner fight for the belt, or fight in a title eliminator for the next shot. You know what I mean? I mean, anything is possible there. Found money is the lightest way to describe that one. That would be leaving a whole huge pile of table on the money and just being dumb about it. I mean, and when you say he's willing to do anything, when you say that, do you mean he's willing to come in for less than he was making?
Well, I mean, he hasn't said it publicly, but he made it clear he only wants to go to the UFC. Mm-hmm. And, if that's your only option and you're willing to basically take whatever's offered to accept it, you're willing to take less. Now, in some ways, I thought, and we talked about this before, I thought the UFC would be smart to kind of match what he's making at PFL or Bellator, because it sends a signal to other fighters, hey, we're not going to take advantage of you. Come over here. We're the good guys. When you talk about fighter first, there's a fighter first thing. We're still going to pay you a similar contract, and we appreciate that you're so interested in coming to the UFC, you're willing to do that. But there's also a strong possibility the UFC could say, oh, how low can we get this guy for? How low are you willing to go to get in the UFC?
Man. Well, I sure hope that they don't lowball him or anything like that. I think that Patricio definitely has value and should be paid accordingly. Dana White, we're on a track here, so we may as well just stick to it. Dana White was at President Trump's inauguration. Is he now basically a power player, a major power player?
I mean, as shocking as it sounds, yes. People seem unwilling to accept this. You see this on Twitter when you bring it up, that Dana White is a major figure now. And, people want to, he's just promoted the UFC, he's a joke and all that stuff. Well, I mean, in some ways he is kind of, because he is, being the head of the UFC is, I wouldn't say a major position in the world, but he is a major figure. He has the direct ear of the president. The president has put him the president has put him on the podium with him several times, right? Up, not on the podium, but up on the stage with him several times for events. He had him speak for him on behalf of him at several events.
He spoke tonight at the inauguration. He spoke today.
Yes, and then he spoke at the Republican National Convention now 3 times or something on behalf of him. He's a guy he calls on constantly. He has a direct line, and so and we also see it the way he just got positioned on Meta because of his connection to Trump. There's no denying it when major news sources basically cite that. These people aren't following MMA. They know that the reason why he's been put on is because it's a signal to the Trump administration that we're playing ball. He's a figure that major sponsors now contact and want the rub from him and the UFC to rebrand their company as more friendly to conservatives after there's blowback. So, there's no, I mean, people will cite like, Don King supported president. Don King did some donations and appeared at a fundraiser. Don King is not on the stage with the guy, right? Don King is not linked directly to him and can't call up the president overnight or use his contacts for him to get favors in return. Dana White is a major player. Also, as someone, as we've talked about before, someone who's a big fan of Lena Khan, I got to say it was a little disheartening to see the picture from that stage and it's Dana White under antitrust violating monopoly, accused of monopoly promotion of the UFC, up there with a bunch of the biggest companies under FTC investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like, this is a major blow for those that are looking for monopoly enforcement. At least that would symbolically, lead me to believe that based on all these monopolists, Bezos, Amazon's being investigated, Tim Cook, Mark Zuckerberg, all these companies, all of them are being looked at for monopoly accusations of abusing monopoly power and being investigated by the FTC. And yet they're all there as part of this, to welcome the new administration. So it suggests to me that maybe certain people will be beyond the reach of any enforcement in the future. And that's a sad, sad fact.
Extra question on this particular topic. We're talking about Dana White being a power player. Let's talk about how he was positioned there. How much did Ari Emanuel have to do with Dana White being in that position, or did Dana end up in that position all on his own?
Well, some way I think Dana did this on his own, but I mean, you got to give Ari some credit. Well, one is Ari has a strong link to Donald Trump as well. He used to represent him, and he kept Dana White in his place in the UFC after they purchased it. They actually promoted him more, and that probably helped because Dana White became a bigger celebrity star figure because of what Endeavor or WME, which I think is going to be their new name again after they go private, took over the UFC when they acquired them. They pushed it White even further ahead. And I should note, remember how for years we had the Zuffa myth?
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!